Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into some really interesting stuff, all about diagnosing autism spectrum disorder.
ASD.
Yeah, ASD, exactly.
And the material you found is fantastic. It's a really thorough online resource, like a guide to living with autism.
I was really impressed. And we're going to zero in on the actual process of diagnosing ASD.
Hmm.
How do professionals go about it?
And what tools are they using?
Exactly. There's this one key tool. It's called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. Have you heard of that?
ADOS. Yes,
Yeah.
pretty central in the field these days.
ADOS, right. We want to really unpack that. And then we'll also touch on some of the other tests and methods that are being used in 2025. So to kick things off, maybe you can give us a little intro to the ADOS. What exactly is it and why is it such a big deal?
Okay, so the ADOS, that's the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule,
Hmm.
and it's basically a standardized assessment. It was specifically created to help diagnose autism spectrum disorders.
I see, to make the diagnosis more objective.
Right, and it was developed by, let me see, Dr. Catherine Lord and her team. The main thing they were trying to do was to figure out a way to evaluate how someone communicates, like their social interaction skills, and also how they play or use their imagination. And they do all this by having the person do certain activities. Some are very structured, others are a bit more free-flowing.
So they're not just relying on someone like a parent or teacher to describe behaviors.
No, they're actually observing them directly,
Yeah.
putting them in situations and seeing how they respond.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, autism can present so differently in different people and at different ages.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes the ADOS so important. It's designed to be used across a huge range of ages and developmental levels.
Mm.
Like, think about how different a toddler might behave compared to, say, a teenager who's really good at talking. You can't really evaluate them in the same way, right?
Right.
So the ADOS, it has all these different sets of activities, and they call them modules. They pick which module to use based on the person's abilities. And this is a key thing, right? This modularity, because it means you can really tailor the assessment to each person. You'll get a much more accurate picture of what's going on.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of test?
It's
Yeah.
definitely not.
Yeah.
And that's important with autism because it's such a, spectrum.
Okay, so walk us through what happens in an ADOS assessment. What kinds of things would someone actually be doing during this?
So picture this. There's a trained examiner, and they're working with the individual. They'll do different tasks, things like telling stories based on pictures, describing what's happening in a scene, maybe even playing some games or interacting with the examiner.
Well, it's not like a traditional test with right or wrong answers. It's more about observing their natural behavior.
That's exactly it. It's about seeing how they naturally interact and communicate in these specific situations that are set up.
And this is where the different modules come in, right?
Yeah, exactly. So as we said, there isn't just one ADOS test. They have these different modules, and each one is designed for people with different language skills and at different stages of development. So someone who's just starting to talk might do different activities than someone who can carry on a full conversation.
Oh, I see. That's super important. Make sure it's appropriate for everyone. And while the person is doing these tasks, what is the examiner actually focusing on? What are the key things they're looking at?
Okay, so they're really looking at a few main areas. First, there's communication. And that means both what the person says and how they say it, like their tone of voice. But it also includes nonverbal stuff, like are they making eye contact, are they using gestures and things like that.
Right, the whole picture.
Yeah, and then there's social interaction. How do they engage with other people? Do they seem interested in what the other person is saying or doing? Do they pick up on social cues? And then for younger kids, they'll also watch them play, what kind of games they play, whether they use toys creatively. And then finally, they'll also be looking for any repetitive behaviors or really intense, narrow interests, because that can be a sign of ASD too.
So it's a very thorough look at a lot of different areas. It's not just one narrow thing they're focusing on.
No, it's really a holistic approach. And that's why the ADOS is so valuable in this whole process of diagnosing autism.
Okay, so let's talk about why it's so important and why it's used so widely. It seems like it's a pretty big deal in the field.
Oh, it is. There are several reasons for that. First, we keep talking about standardization, but that's super important. It means that everyone is doing the assessment in the same way, which makes the results more reliable. You can compare results from different clinicians and know that they mean the same thing. And that leads to more accurate diagnoses, too.
That consistency is so key.
Absolutely. And then there's the fact that it can be used with so many different people. That's because of those modules.
Yeah.
Kids, adults, people who are just starting to talk, people who are very fluent. It can be adapted for all of them.
So it's a really flexible tool.
It is. And it's comprehensive, too. It looks at a whole range of behaviors and skills, not just one or two things. And that gives clinicians a much richer understanding of the person's social and communication profile.
So it's not just about putting a label on someone.
No, it's about understanding them better.
It's about understanding their needs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then another really important thing is that the results of the ADOS can actually help guide treatment. Like, what kind of educational support does this person need? What kind of therapy would be most beneficial? So it's not just about the diagnosis, it's about what happens after that diagnosis. How can we best support this person?
That's the kind of actionable knowledge that our listeners really value.
Yeah, I think so too. It's not just information for information's sake.
Right. It's about what you do with it. Okay. Now, you've mentioned these modules a few times. Maybe you can give us a quick breakdown of what each one is designed for, like in terms of language abilities.
Sure. So the ADOS, the one that's most commonly used now, the ADOS 2, it has 4 main modules. Module 1 is for people who have very little or no speech at all. Module 2 is for people who can speak in phrases, but they're not really fluent. They can't hold a conversation easily. And then Module 3 is for children and young adolescents who are fluent speakers. They can talk without any problems.
Got it.
And then Module 4 is basically the same, but for older adolescents and adults. So it's for fluent speakers, but designed with those older age groups in mind. Oh, and there's also that module for very young kids, right?
Yeah, I saw a mention of a toddler module in the materials.
Yes, right. So that one's specifically designed for those really little ones. Typically, they're between 12 and 30 months old, and they haven't really started using phrase speech consistently yet. So it's kind of like a separate module, but it's still part of that ADOS framework.
I see, tailored for that very early stage of development. Okay, so someone goes through the ADOS, they complete the tasks in their specific module. What happens next? How do they take all those observations and turn them into something useful, like a diagnosis?
So after the assessment, the clinician who did the ADOS, they have this whole system for scoring what they observed. It's very detailed and standardized.
I like that.
There's this code book, and they assign these numerical codes based on how often certain behaviors occurred, how intense they were. And these codes, they cover everything: social communication, repetitive behaviors, the whole 9 yards. Then they use these codes to calculate an algorithm score. Sounds complicated.
It does a bit.
But basically, it boils down to this. They compare that score to these cutoff scores that have been established through a ton of research. And those cutoff scores, they tell you how likely it is that the person has ASD.
So those scores are like benchmark.
Yeah, exactly. They give you a way to compare what you observe to what's considered typical.
Right. So it adds objectivity to the process.
Yeah. But it's really important to remember that the ADOS is just one piece of the puzzle. It's not like you do the ADOS and then boom, you have a diagnosis.
It's not the only thing they look at?
No,
No.
not at all. They always look at the ADOS results along with a bunch of other information. They'll talk to the parents, get a detailed developmental history.
Talk to teachers, maybe?
Yeah, teachers, other professionals who know the person well. And they'll probably do some other testing too, like cognitive testing to see how the person learns and processes information.
Okay, so it's really a multi-pronged approach.
It has to be. Because every person is different, and you need to see the whole picture to get an accurate diagnosis.
That makes sense. Now, like any assessment tool, I'm sure the ADOS has its strengths and weaknesses. What are some of the things to keep in mind there?
You're absolutely right. No tool is perfect. One of the big strengths of the ADOS is, you guessed it, the standardization. It's administered in the same way everywhere, which means the results are more reliable. And there's a ton of research behind it, too. It's been studied and validated extensively, so we know it's a solid tool.
And I imagine the modularity is a big plus, too.
Oh, absolutely. The fact that it can be adapted for different ages and language abilities makes it really useful for a wide range of people.
Okay, so those are some of the positives. What about the limitations? What are some of the potential drawbacks?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that it is based on observations in a specific setting, a clinical setting. And that might not always reflect how the person acts in their everyday life. So it's possible that some subtle symptoms might get missed, or maybe some behaviors might seem more pronounced in that setting than they actually are in real life.
So it's a snapshot, not the whole film.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. And then there's also the fact that it might not be as good at picking up on ASD in people who have very mild symptoms, or in people who are very verbal, really good at talking, or who are intellectually gifted. Those folks, they might not show the typical signs of ASD as clearly during those structured tasks.
I see.
So, yeah, it's not a perfect tool. But when it's used as part of a comprehensive evaluation, along with all that other information we talked about, it can be incredibly helpful.
It's a piece of the puzzle, but an important one.
Exactly.
Now, I know you've got some examples of how the ADOS actually plays out in real life. Maybe we can walk through a few of those just to give people a clearer picture of what it looks like.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's start with, let's say, a little guy, maybe 3 years old, who's not using a lot of words yet. You'd be doing module 1. So picture this. The examiner puts out some toys, like a ball, a car, and a doll. And then they just watch how the child interacts with them. They're looking for things like, does he try to communicate, even without words, like pointing or making eye contact? Does he show any interest in what the examiner is doing? Does he try to get them to play with him? And how does he play? Does he pretend, like pretending to feed the doll? Or is he just doing simple things with the toys, like rolling the car back and forth?
So they're observing all the nuances of his play and his interaction.
Exactly. And in this particular example, the outcome, let me see. Oh, yeah. The child didn't make much eye contact. He wasn't really interested in the toys, unless the examiner was right there with him, and he didn't do any pretend play at all. So those were all things that the clinician would take note of and consider when making a diagnosis.
Really gives you a concrete picture.
Right. Okay. Now let's move on to, say, an 8-year-old girl who can speak fluently. She'll be doing module 3, and for her, one of the tasks might be to make up a story based on a series of pictures. So the examiner would be looking at how well she can tell a story. Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Does it make sense? But they're also looking at her social communication, things like eye contact, gestures, tone of voice, all that. And they're also interested in how flexible she is. If the examiner throws in a new element, asks her to change the story a bit, can she adapt easily?
So it's not just about what she says, it's about how she interacts while she's telling the story.
Exactly. And in this example, she was able to tell a very detailed story, but she avoided eye contact the whole time. Her voice was very flat, and she really struggled to change the story when the examiner asked her to. She was very stuck on her original idea.
Interesting. Okay, and what about an adult, someone who might be showing some signs of ASD?
All right, so for an adult, maybe a 20-year-old guy, he'd be doing module 4. And the assessment might be more like a conversation, talking about his life, his interests, his relationships, things like that. And in this case, the examiner would be really paying attention to his social interaction skills. Does he respond appropriately to social cues? Is he interested in what the examiner is asking? Does he keep the conversation going?
So more nuanced observations.
Yeah, definitely. And they'd also be looking at his communication style. Is it appropriate for the situation? And they'd be listening for anything that might suggest he has very intense or narrow interests or repetitive behaviors.
Right.
So in this example, this particular guy, he kept steering the conversation back to one very specific topic that he was really into, and he wasn't picking up on the examiner's cues that they wanted to talk about something else.
I see. So he was kind of missing those social cues.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And all of this information from all 3 of these examples would be factored into the overall evaluation.
Okay, that really helps to see how the ADOS works in practice. Now, the material you brought also talks about other tools and methods that are used to assess ASD besides just the ADOS.
Yeah, there's a whole range of them.
It's not just one test and done.
No, not at all. The ADOS is important, but it's just one piece of a much bigger process.
Okay, let's start with the younger kids. There's a tool called the MCHAT-TR that seems to be pretty widely used for toddlers.
Yeah, that's the Modified Checklist for Autism in Toddlers Revised. It's a screening tool, so it's not used to make a diagnosis, but it helps to identify little kids who might be at risk for autism so they can get a more thorough evaluation.
And it's for really young kids, right?
Yeah, it's designed for toddlers between 16 and 30 months old.
Wow, that's young.
It is. And it's actually a questionnaire that the parents fill out. It takes about maybe 5 to 10 minutes. There are about 20 questions.
Okay, and what kinds of things does it ask about? Like, what would raise a red flag?
Well, it focuses on those early developmental milestones that can be signs of autism. Things like, does the child make eye contact? Do they respond to their name? Do they point at things to show you what they're interested in? Do they like to play peekaboo? Those kinds of things.
Those are all really important milestones.
They are. And based on how the parents answer those questions, the MCHAT-R gives them a score. And that score tells them if their child is a low, moderate, or high risk for ASD.
I see.
But, and this is important, even if the score is high, it doesn't automatically mean the child has autism. It just means they need to see a specialist for a more thorough evaluation, to rule out other possibilities and make sure they get the right support.
So it's a first step.
Exactly. It's a way to catch potential problems early on.
Okay. And then for older kids, there's a tool called the ASSQ, right?
Yeah, the Autism Spectrum Screening Questionnaire. That one's designed for kids and teens between 7 and 16 years old.
Okay, so school-aged kids.
Right. And this one, it has 27 questions, and they focus on social interactions, communication, and other behaviors that are common in ASD. And a cool thing about this one is that either parents or teachers can fill it out.
Oh, that's interesting. So you get perspectives from different settings.
Exactly. And it doesn't take long, usually about 10 minutes.
So it's relatively quick and easy to administer.
It is. Now, from the research, it seems like the ASSQ is pretty good at identifying kids who do have autism, but it's not perfect. It sometimes flags kids who don't have autism, too.
False positives.
Yeah, and that's why, just like the MCHAT-ER, a positive result on the ASAQ means the child should get a more comprehensive evaluation.
Got it. So it's a screening tool, not a diagnostic tool.
Right. It's just a starting point.
And there's another one for this age range, too, the SEQ.
Yes, the Social Communication Questionnaire. It used to be called the Autism Screening Questionnaire. And there are two versions of this one, a lifetime form and a current form. Both have 40 yes or no questions, and they're designed for parents or caregivers to fill out on their own, without a clinician there.
Okay, that makes it easy to administer.
Yeah, and the lifetime form asks about the person's whole developmental history, so it's good for figuring out if they've always had autistic traits, from a young age. And that can help determine if they might need a full evaluation.
So it looks back at their whole life.
Right. And the current form focuses on just the last 3 months, so it's more useful for seeing how someone's doing right now or for tracking progress over time, like if they're getting therapy.
I see. It's more about the present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So both versions are helpful, but for different purposes.
And the SEQ is known for being pretty quick and easy, right?
Oh, yeah, it's super short, which makes it a good option for, just getting a general idea of whether there might be some concern.
Okay, so we've covered some of the screening tools. What about those more in-depth tools that are used for actual diagnosis, the ones that go beyond just screening?
Yeah, the big one there is the ADIR, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. This one is really comprehensive. It's considered the gold standard for diagnosing ASD.
Wow, the gold standard. That's saying something.
It is. It's a really thorough interview, and it's done by a trained clinician with a parent or caregiver, someone who knows the person's history really well.
Okay, so it involves gathering a lot of detailed information.
A ton of information.
Yeah.
It can be used for both kids and adults, as long as they have a mental age of at least 2 years old. And there are 93 items in this interview. It covers everything: their language development, their social interactions, any repetitive behaviors or interests. It takes a while to do, usually an hour and a half to 2.5 hours.
Wow, that's a long interview.
It is. But it's very thorough, and it gives clinicians a really rich understanding of the person's strengths and challenges, and that's why it's used so much in both clinical settings and in research.
It's really considered the most in-depth tool out there.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's always evolving, too. The field is constantly trying to improve these tools and make them even more accurate and helpful.
Now, I know the field of autism assessment is constantly changing. What are some of the newer approaches that are emerging in 2025? I imagine technology is playing a bigger role.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of excitement around using technology to make assessments even better. Like, there's eye tracking technology, where they can actually measure where someone is looking during a social interaction, and that can give them clues about how they're processing social information.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Right. And then there are all these machine learning algorithms that are being developed, and these could potentially help analyze all that data that's collected during assessments, find patterns that humans might miss.
So computers are helping us to understand autism better.
Yeah, in a way. But I think it's important to emphasize that most experts agree that technology should never be used alone. It's a tool, not a replacement for clinical judgment.
So it's about combining the best of both worlds, human expertise and technology.
Exactly. And then there's another really interesting shift that's happening, and that's the move towards what they call neurodiversity affirming assessments.
Yes, I saw that mentioned in the material. Tell us more about that.
So basically, it's about recognizing that autism isn't just a bunch of deficits or problems to be fixed. It's about seeing the strengths and the unique perspectives that autistic people bring to the table.
So it's a more positive and respectful approach.
Exactly. And it's about making sure that the assessment process itself is a positive experience, not something that makes people feel bad about themselves. So this means really listening to the person being assessed, hearing their experiences and valuing their perspective. It's also about identifying their strengths, not just focusing on what they struggle with. And it's even about the language that clinicians use when talking about their results. Trying to use more positive and empowering language.
That's so important. I imagine it can make a huge difference in how people feel about the whole process.
Oh, absolutely. It's a big shift in the field, but it's a really important one. It's about moving away from that old deficit-based model of autism and embracing a more holistic and affirming view.
It's about seeing the whole person, not just a diagnosis.
Yes, exactly.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've learned so much about the different tools and approaches that are used to diagnose ASD.
It's a complex topic, but hopefully we shed some light on it.
I think we have. Just to recap for our listener, we took a deep dive into the ADOS. We learned about its different modules, how it's administered, and why it's so important in the assessment process. We also talked about other screening tools, like the MCHAT-UR for toddlers, the ASQ, and the SCQ for older kids. And then we talked about that gold standard diagnostic tool, the ADIR. So you should have a pretty good overview of how autism is evaluated in 2025.
And the key takeaway, I think, is that it's a multifaceted process. There's no single test that tells you everything you need to know. It takes a team of experts using a variety of tools to really understand each individual.
Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap things up, here's a final thought for our listener to ponder. We've talked about the strengths and limitations of observation-based tools like the ADOS, and we've talked about the rise of technology and this move towards neurodiversity-affirming practices. So the question is, how do you think these trends will shape the future of autism diagnosis? Will we see even more personalized and holistic approaches?
That's a great question. I think it's an exciting time for the field. There's so much potential for innovation and for creating assessments that are truly individualized and strengths-based.
I agree. It'll be interesting to see what the next few years bring.
Absolutely.
And for those of you who want to delve deeper into this topic, the online resource we use today, especially the website 101autism.com, has a lot of great information. And they also have a list of referrals, so you can connect with professionals in your area if you have any questions or concerns.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource. Highly recommend it.
Yeah.
It's clear that the field of autism assessment is constantly evolving. It's a complex area, and there's still so much we're learning. But one thing is certain. A comprehensive and thoughtful approach to assessment is absolutely essential for understanding and supporting autistic individuals.
I couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time.
See you then.